Now that we've covered the established story of Dennis Martin, those of you familiar with the case are probably wondering why our story so far differs somewhat drastically from what can be found online, and the theories about what really happened to Dennis. To give those of you unfamiliar with the case an idea of what we mean, here are the top Google searches when you type the name Dennis Martin into Google. Dennis Martin cannibalism, feral humans Smoky Mountains, Dennis Martin wild man, Dennis Martin feral, Dennis Martin obituary, Dennis Martin disappearances psychic, and Dennis Martin Reddit. Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. A follow-up on these searches will give you stories about Reddit detectives and their insider information about cannibalistic, sometimes inbred hill people that live in tribes in the woods. But before we get to that, let's look at how these rumors started. Much of the misinformation about the case can be traced back to the book Missing 411, Eastern United States by David Poliitis. That's a name very well known to the true crime community. David Poliitis is a former police detective who does research into cases of people missing from national parks. He's written 9 books about this topic so far, covering well over 1,000 cases, and he's brought attention to cases that would otherwise have vanished from the public eye completely. The problem is that Poliitis looks at all these cases through the lens of conspiracy. He doesn't trust park officials and often paints their motives as nefarious. And anytime the FBI shows up on a case, he writes about them as if they are the men in black, there to cover up what's really going on at the cost of even the lives of the missing. Poliitis' work is largely about connecting the patterns found among those missing. He'll point out how many people go missing picking berries or wearing red shirts. Boulder fields apparently carry a great significance, and he often notes their presence during disappearances, but won't say why. He'll point out how it often rains or snows heavily right after someone vanishes. The patterns he tries to connect bring to mind the word Epiphenia, which is, according to the dictionary definition, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. The human brain can find patterns anywhere, and for the last few years on the internet, there have been graphs circulating to try and illustrate how correlation does not equal causation. In fact, what many see as patterns are often completely random. A few examples are how the number of people who drowned in swimming pools correlates with the number of movies Nicolas Cage appeared in, or the number of letters used in a spelling bee almost exactly correlates to the number of people killed by venomous spiders. You can often find 2 statistics that correlate, but that does not usually indicate causation. The boulder fields and berry bushes, and hikers wearing red shirts, could very well all be completely random coincidences. Though some of the patterns Poliitis likes to point out seem correlated, in reality, they are more likely just additional risk factors. For example, many people who go missing have some kind of disability which is implied to be connected to his theories. But it is more likely that more people with disabilities happen to get lost in the woods, a confounding factor. Or they were picking berries, which he implies the berries are the relevant part. But it could be that those going after berries are journeying into the deeper and thus more dangerous sections of woods. Not to mention that in areas populated by bears, they will also be seeking out berries. It's hard to criticize Poliitis when our show and the general public likely wouldn't still be talking about the Dennis Martin case if he hadn't popularized it. He brings a lot of attention to cases that would otherwise have been forgotten by the media, and he provides a non-judgmental platform for the families of missing people to tell their stories. But with that acknowledgement, we wanted to go over his version of events in detail and how they differ from the established sources we found. It is important to do this because Poliitis' account has pretty much become the accepted narrative in the mainstream today. However, some important aspects of the story he provides seem incorrect. From the very start, things in the Missing 411 book are wrong. Poliitis says that William, Clyde, Dennis, and Doug had hiked to Spence Field alone, and that, quote, another family met them in the meadow and asked whether they could join their boys in playtime. And one of the more coincidental parts of this case, this other family was also named Martin. We know from Dwight McCarter's book, Lost, that the other Martins were distant cousins, and they were there because the Martins were there every year. Poliitis actually interviewed McCarter for his book, but apparently had not read McCarter's book. A few details were wrong about Dennis's disappearance. Poliitis claims that Dennis vanished during a game of hide-and-seek, but it is easy to see where this came from, as later papers did spread this rumor. Likely started by a Jackson Sun article from June 16th that got it wrong. He also lists the time Dennis went missing as 3:30 p.m., when most sources, including the NPS Disclosure, say 4:30. About the search itself, Poliitis writes about the military as if their involvement is part of the conspiracy he is promoting. In response to the July 15th search, he says, quote, in researching hundreds of missing people, I've never seen this level of response for someone missing less than 24 hours. The fact the Green Berets were dispatched almost makes it seem as though they were up against something very unusual, and someone knew it. He does not specify what this unusual threat was. In his account of June 29th, Poliitis again makes another statement that makes it clear he has not really researched Dwight McCarter, despite touting him as a source for his interview. Poliitis says Dwight McCarter was one of the 3 people committed to stay on the search. That is not true. McCarter was only 24 at the time and considered himself inexperienced. And anyway, he gave the names of the 3 people who were to stay on the search in his book. He did join them at least on July 3rd, but he was not assigned to the case. Why Poliitis would make such a blatant error is unclear. When getting into the FBI's involvement about Harold Keyes' story, he immediately views them with suspicion. When he talks about the FBI telling William they didn't have enough evidence to prove a kidnapping, Poliitis cryptically writes, quote, he couldn't convince the FBI or the local FBI had orders not to be involved. Poliitis' version of Harold Keyes' sighting is much more colorful than the one presented in the papers and the NPS disclosure. He contradicts himself about when Key reported the sighting, saying Key called authorities the next day, when previously he had said that Key called the FBI 2 days later. Most of the July articles from the local newspapers claim Key came forward in July, and he didn't start to think the scream could be connected to Dennis's disappearance until the Martin family started to speculate about kidnapping to the media. In fact, a Kingsport Times article from July 22nd quotes Key as saying that his family had talked about reporting the scream earlier, but decided against it because, quote, so many crackpots call in about that sort of thing. Poliitis immediately casts suspicion on the FBI's interview with Key about the incident, and he often points to Jim Reike as being suspicious. He says, quote, one of the fascinating parts of this interview is that Mr. Key had volunteered to come to the park and meet with investigators. This did not happen. FBI agent Jim Reike intercepted Mr. Key and met him away from the park to have the debriefing. We know from William's letter on July 28th that this is false. He says the FBI and park rangers had Key take them to the area where he heard the scream. William himself says the FBI either met or brought Key to the park. Despite wanting to criticize the FBI, Poliitis missed some very intriguing points about the letter that really do kind of make the FBI look bad. And their response, as we saw in Part 2, was somewhat rude and completely dismissed William's concerns that the FBI had gotten some information wrong. In his letter, William points out that there was confusion between what was reported to the media and what Key actually said. When they brought William to the area Key had taken them to, it was actually about a mile from Sea Branch, the area reported in the media, and William noted the terrain and foliage was different from the area that Key had told him about. so he seems skeptical that Key had even taken the Rangers to the right area. The possible confusion is not addressed in any articles we found, but early articles about the Key sighting did seem to think that he could have been very close to Spence Field, even on Boat Mountain Road. A later part in the book provides some more interesting points about the Key sighting. As we mentioned earlier, it's a bit of an odd position to criticize Poliitis for information that we wouldn't otherwise have, and a very interesting article that he brought up was from July 21st of 1969. The article ran in the Knoxville Journal and was titled, "Foul Play Suggested in Martin Boy Mystery." The Knoxville Journal had not been digitized from this time, so without the missing 411 book, our team would not have even known to look for this article. In this article, Key says he and his family drove to a spot, quote, below Spence Field. Here's the full account he gave in the article. Quote, "My two boys and Gary Grandstaff, my daughter's boyfriend, wanted to explore and perhaps find a bear. There was an unoccupied car parked nearby, a 1960 model or older, I think, but I didn't notice what make it was. My wife and daughter did not go far with us. We had gone a half a mile or so when we heard an awful scream that sounded like someone in trouble. There was a stream there. As we were going up it, one of my boys said, 'Look, Daddy, there's a bear.' I looked. It wasn't a bear. It was a man. I couldn't get a good look at him because he seemed hidden behind the bushes. When we went back to our car, the other car was gone." Key figured it was a moonshiner and didn't think it was connected to Dennis's case. The article says, quote, "Key said he does not know the Great Smoky Park or Cades Cove very well, and so cannot describe exactly where he and his family were at the time. However, he is certain they were near Spence Field, because a park ranger told him so." Later on, Poliitis tries to prove that someone or something could have taken Dennis to Sea Branch from Spence Field within 2 hours, the maximum time frame established from when Dennis vanished to when Key heard the scream. But he didn't realize there were plenty of articles and sources, some that he even cited, that claim Key could have actually been much closer to Spence Field than the Rangers had guessed. Poliitis chose not to focus on this. Instead, he complains that the FBI would not give him the transcript of the interview they conducted with Key, and goes on to cryptically say, quote, "The idea that a witness would mistake a hairy bear for a human doesn't make a lot of sense, unless the human was very hairy or they were wearing a shaggy, large coat." Perhaps the most groundbreaking part of Poliitis' book is an interview that he conducted with William Martin at his family home in August of 2011. Given the inconsistencies we've already gone over thus far, and the fact that this interview was not recorded, we advise listeners to take this interview with a grain of salt. Mr. Martin initially did not want to be interviewed, but eventually relented when Poliitis explained he'd come all the way from California and would keep it brief. Supposedly, William told Poliitis that when he spoke to Harold Key, he, quote, was told things that you won't read in a newspaper. William apparently stated that he was so concerned that he and a National Park Service's fire prevention officer hiked from Spence Field to the area of the Key sightings in 90 minutes. They didn't find anything, but they did prove that the hike could be made in the time frame of when Dennis disappeared and the Key family sighting. 7 miles in 90 minutes seems like a stretch, but William was an avid hiker, so it's possible if he jogged he could do it. And it was all downhill. Plus, if there was a creek bed or something they could follow that was more direct, it was only 4 miles by air. When Poliitis inquired about what it was that wasn't in the papers, Martin told him that, quote, Key had thought they saw a dark-figured man running along a ridgeline, carrying something on his shoulder. He then goes on to say that Martin cryptically told him that the head of the Park Service was a, quote, figurehead. He also pointed out that Jim Reike committed suicide and seemed to think this was relevant to the case, but would not elaborate on how. Martin concluded the interview by saying that he believed someone had taken Dennis off the mountain. On January 3rd of 1973, Jim Reike died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He'd worked for the FBI for 26 years on numerous high-profile cases, and he left behind a wife and 3 children. But whatever supposed relevance this had to Poliitis' vague conspiracy is unclear. Another important piece of information that Poliitis uncovered was that he did provide a more coherent version of psychic Harold Sherman's predictions. Sherman's full predictions are as follows, quote, I am impelled to ask you if you know whether or not there have been or are any questionable characters in this region. Camping in the wild in this area? Like hermits, squatters? Such an individual may not be connected with the boy's disappearance at all, but I feel that a sex maniac, so-called, does exist in the vicinity and could have trailed the boy. I hesitate to write any more, as my conscious mind is trying to reject such a feeling. I see something red, and something being carried or dragged. Are there any caves in the vicinity? A stream may even run through it, or part of it. I am always tormented when impressions come to my conscious mind, trying to tell me that they couldn't possibly be true. But I get a feeling of sudden panic on the part of Dennis. What happened to him occurred suddenly, unexpectedly, and he could not or did not cry out. He seems to be struck down by something. The area is rugged. It's interesting that this account differs so greatly from the one presented in the NPS disclosure, and also conveniently backs up never-before-heard claims that the man Key saw was carrying something. Poliitis also claimed to have interviewed Dwight McCarter. McCarter said that it was very possible that a man could carry a boy from Spence Field to the Sea Branch area. That part can be verified by later interviews. Dwight told the papers that did anniversary articles about the case he fully believed a fit man could carry a boy from Spence Field to Sea Branch in a reasonable amount of time. To get back to the missing 411 interview, McCarter also said that, quote, the FBI knows nothing about people moving through the woods and time frames of possibilities. Yet they told everyone involved that the Key family sighting was not relevant. He also claimed to have walked from Spence Field to Rowan's Creek in the time frame given by Harold Key. An odd bit that sticks out during the interview was when Poliitis said, quote, I asked Dwight what he thought had made the sickening scream heard by the Keys. He stated it might have been Dennis. I advised Dwight that the description of the scream by the Keys appears to be too loud for a small boy to have made. There was no response. The most interesting part of this supposed interview was the following, quote, I asked Dwight why one of the children of the Keys would first state that he observed a bear, and then his father stated they saw a man. Dwight hesitated for several minutes, then said in and around the park there are wild men. He stated that there is more than one. They are hairy, dirty, and one even had an old bear skin that he wore. Dwight was careful with his words, but did state that these men lived in the wild and were essentially living off the land in and around the park. I asked if he thought Dennis was taken by a wild man. He stated that at the time he really gave it little thought. The only wild man he knew in the park at the time lived at the other end, near Cataloochee Valley, and didn't venture into the area where Dennis disappeared, or the area of Cade's Cove at the bottom of Rowan's Creek. Dwight McCarter made it clear that the wild men he was speaking about were humans who decided to live in the wild. They had little contact with humanity, and they appeared as the name implied, wild and unkempt. This was the first, last, and only time I have ever heard anyone mention wild men inside of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Dwight McCarter never shared this supposed theory with any newspapers that we could find, and did not discuss it in the chapter of his book that covered Dennis's disappearance. After these interviews, Paulides goes on to speculate more about the Army. He claims that the Green Berets, quote, entered the park, armed themselves, and then conducted a search without coordinating efforts with NPS trackers. This is not true. Colonel Kinney was quoted in both the Statesville Record and the Greensboro Daily News as saying they were just searching whatever area the NPS directed them to. It's true that at times they did have their own camps set up, but that's because they were sent into the more dangerous areas. You wouldn't ask a weekend volunteer to rappel down the side of a cliff and chop up trees with a chainsaw to build a helipad. Though the question of whether they were armed is unclear. They did have bags full of gear in all the photos of them, and a Johnson City Press article from June 20th, 1969, claims that, quote, 200 heavily armed National Guardsmen joined in on the search. They'd been brought in from Mississippi, where they were doing maneuvers. But this was referring to the National Guard brought in later, not the Green Berets. They were killing and eating a lot of snakes, though, so they did have either knives or guns. Poliitis points to it being suspicious that Cades Cove Loop was closed for 3 days. Quote, the area was closed just after the Key family had made their observation. Cades Cove is near Rowan's Creek and the Sea Branch area, but as pretty much every article from the Times states, it was the base of operations for the search. Numerous local articles in the NPS Disclosure say it was closed the weekend where there were over 1,000 searchers, and it was kept closed an additional day that week due to flooding. He then goes on to question why the Sea Branch area was not part of the search. While no articles specifically mention the Sea Branch area being searched, William did lead a search party on the 24th through much of Cades Cove, and the fact that they found the boy resembling Dennis at the Cades Cove campground means searchers did look very close to that area. As Sea Branch is very close to the campground, it's probable that area was part of the search. A Daily News article from June 24th says, quote, Sunday, Martin led a search of old buildings, home sites, corn cribs, hog pens, and other structures in Cades Cove, 4 miles from Spence Field, where the brown-eyed, curly-haired boy was last seen while on a Father's Day outing. So it's possible William himself was in the area, as Sea Branch was 4 miles from Spence Field by air. Poliitis then goes on to speculate that the Sea Branch area was searched in secret, then says, quote, the real question is, why wouldn't SAR commanders admit to having expanded the perimeter into including Rowan's Creek and Sea Branch in the search area? I believe that the Green Berets were given this task, and this is why they had special communications that did not interact with NPS radios, and why their helicopters were landing at the cove. As we've covered, everyone was at the cove. It's where all of the searchers drove to because it was the closest accessible point to Spence Field by car. It would be extremely hard to conduct a secretive operation when reporters and volunteers were all in the cove. And for secretive communications, it's unclear what this means. So Poliitis insinuates that it's suspicious they didn't search Cades Cove, which was 7 miles away by trail. But then he criticizes the Fontana Lake search for being suspicious and excessive, when that was 8 miles from the point last seen. He said, quote, the Coast Guard had committed 2 boats to Fontana Lake to search for any possible evidence, even though the lake was outside the park boundary and was miles away. The NPS Disclosure said they were patrolling the shores of Fontana and dropping men off to head up the drainage areas. Eagle Creek, where the footprints were found, and several other creeks from Spence Field drain out to Fontana Dam. They were looking to see if his body had been washed down a drainage area. A rather cryptic part of Poliitis' account is that he places great emphasis on a suggestion called in by local reporter Carson Brewer, who did much of the coverage on the Key story. On June 26th, Brewer called to say he'd gotten a suggestion from a reader that they should, quote, start looking in treetops, stop looking on the ground. Poliitis points out that this is a rather unsettling suggestion and has been suggested in other missing 411 cases. This suggestion looks less odd when placed with the other suggestions noted down by the NPS. Some were practical. Someone called in to Cades Cove store to say that there was a small cave where 2 trails met in Spence Field, but it was hard to find. The caller said they should look for the fern growing out of it. One important tip was from a man who claimed he'd spotted a young boy by himself near the Elkmont area by a waterfall. But this was apparently checked and nothing was found. It's possible this was someone calling in trying to get them to follow up on a prediction Gene Dixon had made, as Gene Dixon said Dennis could be found, quote, 5 miles southeast from the area he was last seen, on a stream by a waterfall that has white pines in the area. And perhaps this cryptic suggestion of looking in the trees was from a caller trying to get the NPS to follow up on Harold Sherman's initial suggestion that Dennis's body might be, quote, hung up in bushes. As we've discussed, the public pressure to follow up on psychic leads was immense, because Martin was very open to the papers that he wanted the leads taken with the utmost seriousness. Also, some of the suggestions called in by the public were clearly just bored people, or they were likely jokes, like the following submitted by Glenn Chandler from Tennessee. He said, quote, take several friendly dogs, including Boy's Own, put package containing food and plastic raincoat around neck. Release dogs 1 to 2 miles apart. Be sure dogs are lost same as Dennis. By chance, one may find his trail and follow him for friendship. Dogs could be released by helicopter. Thank you. So maybe the listener tips just shouldn't be taken too seriously, and there wasn't anything grand and mysterious about a listener who thought they should look in the treetops. Near the end of his chapter on Dennis, Poliitis went on to speculate more about the FBI meeting that Key had with Reike. He said, quote, it sounds almost as if Special Agent Jim Reike knew the Keys had an unusual event happen to them. So unusual that he didn't want them coming to the park, which again we know is false. He did come to the park. He goes on to claim the FBI refused his Freedom of Information Act request because they were trying to hide the information discussed by Harold Key and Jim Reike. Now that we've looked over Poliitis' account in detail, we'd like to point out that an interesting aspect of Poliitis' work is something known as hyperactive agency detection. It's present in most conspiracy theories, and it is the need to find a reason or agency behind events. It's a human phenomenon, and is a response to the chaotic nature of chance. It's easier to think there is some force behind everything. It means there's some kind of plan or reason to big events that are often frightening, or that there is a way to prevent what are actually random occurrences. For many people, it is easier to believe that there is some nefarious force behind the disappearances than to think it's actually incredibly easy to get lost and die in the woods, or for small children to be stolen and eaten by wild animals. It just makes more sense to our brains that if our child goes missing, there must be some kind of reason to it, or something to blame. Those of you who've heard of Missing 411 before undoubtedly have an idea of what Poliitis is talking about when he alludes to unusual threats, and something ominous that the soldiers were up against. And though he does not say it in this book, the big threat, the supernatural entity that defies logic that is taking these missing people, is Bigfoot. Poliitis is a huge Bigfoot believer. He's written books about the subject that he says conclusively prove that Bigfoot is real, but he doesn't ever come out and mention the creature in his Missing 411 work. He came close in his last documentary, hinting that he may believe in aliens as well, and that Bigfoot is an alien, or at least connected to UFO activity. But when asked about his theories on Missing 411 phenomenon, he refuses to give any explanations. He wants to be taken seriously in the true crime community, so he never explicitly mentions Bigfoot in any of his true crime books, but will emphasize certain witness statements that could hint at the creature. Hence his emphasis on why a person could mistake a bear for a man in the Key sighting, and talking about some vague threat lurking in the woods that would need legions of soldiers to take down. In 2012, Poliitis visited Alcoa, Tennessee, to give out copies of his book and give a media conference about it. He discussed the Dennis Martin case in detail. He talked about the Green Berets and the Wild Men, but said, quote, "I'm not making any allegations," when asked what he was trying to get at. The reporters seemed frustrated with the conference, and in general, many critics of his work are frustrated with his refusal to outright discuss what he is implying. However, not everyone who learns of the missing 411 phenomena knows of his Bigfoot theories, or they don't think he's suggesting Bigfoot in all cases. And he absolutely doesn't seem to hint at Bigfoot in all of his cases. But in the Dennis Martin one, it seems like the clear culprit he's trying to pin the case on when you know his background. However, in being so vague about what he actually believes, he's created a rather sinister story for those reading it unaware of what he was trying to hint at. In being too vague and peddling his Bigfoot theory, he's written a story that seems to imply wild men in the forest are stealing children, and they're so powerful that they need an entire army to stop them. And well, the internet has taken this theory and gone wild with it. Internet detectives have taken Poliitis' story and created theories and rumors that put a simple case of Bigfoot kidnapping to shame. It started on the Missing 411 subreddit in a post titled, "I live in the Great Smoky Mountains, and I know what snatches children." In this post, a Reddit user, whose first name is Eric, claims that he has lived on the North Carolina side of the Smokies for his whole life. He claims that there have been feral people living in the woods since the 30s or 40s, and all the locals know about it. Quote, "The FBI knows. It's why they do not get involved. I've heard other stories that there was some attempt to kill these feral wild men, but they still exist, even today. And I'm not talking about some end-of-days extremists who took to the woods. I mean feral, completely wild men, their own language, living underground." He has other posts that go into detail about how they reproduce, speculating that they might be stealing women. But then he realizes that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Quote, "We hear stories all the time of women being impregnated by aliens, so of course there are a lot of unanswered questions on how this is accomplished by the ferals. I do not think that this happens often, so that leads to incest." He goes on to say how inbreeding has changed their DNA so they're immune to complications of cannibalism, such as kuru. But it has also deformed them. Quote, "Eyewitness reports that have dated back to the 1840s show that the ferals are, well, something out of your worst nightmare. We're talking about deformities that include one eye way up on the forehead and the second eye down by the nose, lumps and humps on the back, visible rib cage, oversized kneecaps and large feet, hair growth patterns that are splotchy throughout the body, and a cranium that is too large in comparison to the face. The skin has developed calluses and is thick due to the elements. A creature that is too human to be a creature, yet a human that is too frightful to possibly be human. It is a mix of both, and it lives today." He does acknowledge the similarities to The Hills Have Eyes by saying that it was actually inspired by the feral people of the Smokies. His writing is inconsistent, to say the least, first claiming they've been around since the 1940s, then moving it back a century to the 1800s. He at first claims to have never met them, but then goes into details that seem quite frankly impossible to know without an encounter. Quote, "From time to time they will snatch a vulnerable hiker and make a meal out of the kidneys, spleen, eyeballs, and the buttocks." He also makes it very clear he believes in Bigfoot as well, and at one point says, quote, "Inside of the mountains and in caves is where all of our wild men, Bigfoot, creatures are at, and it's why they cannot be found. It is worldwide. Governments know of them. They do not get involved with these creatures unless there is a disappearance they have to go in and kill, as they did with Dennis Martin. Our governments admitting to creatures and UFOs would break down our religious systems. Dealing with the public about these creatures is something that has been avoided for years at all costs. Our caves and mountains cannot be controlled. The underground cave systems are massive, and what's in them is beyond basic human comprehension." After his posts on the Missing 411 sub became popular, he made his own subreddit called In the Hills. Here's the post he made explaining what his subreddit is for. Dennis Martin disappeared in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee in 1969. The search effort consisted of almost 1,400 people and is the largest manhunt in the park to date. Eyewitness reports of the 6-year-old being snatched by a feral man have been kept a secret to the public. Dennis Martin was never found. Since the 1840s, there have been reports of feral men roaming the Great Smoky Mountains from Tennessee, North Carolina, all the way through West Virginia. They hide in caves, tunnels, and bunkers, some designed by their own hand. These feral wild men are described as being part man and part creature, inbreds with major deformities. They may be responsible for hundreds of missing persons in the Great Smoky Mountains. Their traps in the hills are designed strategically at ground level for people to fall into, leading them deep into their tunnels. The feral wild men will devour you to leave nothing left. They will hide in the treetops, watching and waiting for you to wander off trail. Their smell is putrid and unmistakable. Unlike Bigfoot, their clans are not plentiful, and they do a great job at staying hidden. He goes on to make other posts about Dennis Martin, making claims such as, quote, "On June 23rd, police dogs were brought in, but it was reported that the dogs refused to track the area, only sitting down and whimpering." He then goes on to say that, quote, "Insight from locals include that the military had knowledge of the feral wild men in the Great Smoky Mountains, and this is why they got involved with the Martin case. While the Green Berets were in those woods, they killed over 30 feral wild men, including the one that snatched Dennis Martin. The military did find the bones and clothes that belonged to Dennis, but it was decided not to inform the family, as they could not handle it. The wild man had eaten Dennis, and this has been kept from the family and media for years. The sources he cites for this are the wiki page on Dennis Martin and the Freedom of Information Act request. Obviously, neither of which talk about any of this. In another post, he mentions Jim Reike, saying, quote, "One of the agents that worked on this and was ordered into the woods to kill the feral men ended up committing suicide some years later, not being able to cope with what he had seen in those mountains, and after other assignments into similar incidents." Eric's motive for creating these posts is unclear. It seems that if he was genuine, he would be more consistent in his reporting. Our show actually thought it was a creepypasta type subreddit, but we have been assured by its members that it is not. A few years ago, there was a series of fictional stories going around the subreddit No Sleep that were heavily influenced by Poliitis' work. It was about the secretive and paranormal encounters of an SAR officer. It blew up, and the writer of the story even got a movie deal. Perhaps the creator of In the Hills is hoping for his own movie deal, or perhaps he just wants to create an urban legend. But either way, he's writing what is basically fan fiction about real people. Dennis Martin's siblings are likely still alive, Jim Reike's children as well, and they might stumble across his needlessly graphic and outlandish descriptions. Now, to many people, these stories seem obviously fabricated, but despite being obviously largely created by one man, the theories spread to blogs and other subreddits and eventually to TikTok. The missing 411 topic is occasionally brought up there, but never to this magnitude. The post started going viral near the start of 2021, and as of the time this episode was written, the feral people hashtag on TikTok has 39.5 million views. Granted, some of those are not about people in the woods, but rather related to the furry subculture. Also, it's likely the popularity was not all due to the Reddit mod of In the Hills. One of the earliest TikToks about feral people to go viral was from a user who claimed to have heard a family screaming in distress in the woods near Big Bend National Park. She called the police and the rangers, but they didn't find anything. She followed up with them the next day, and they allegedly claimed not to know what she was talking about. She later deleted the video, adding to the element of conspiracy on the part of the park rangers that she'd hinted at. Stories started coming in from all over the world, but many of them were about the cannibalistic hill people of the Smokies. One girl claims her father was a park ranger during the Dennis Martin search, and all of the older people in Townsend, Tennessee, know about the feral people. Others share strange stories or encounters that they themselves have had in the woods. Some just parrot what they've heard about cannibalistic feral people as if it is fact. Surprisingly, TikTok was faster than Reddit to try and curb the rumors. People started responding. saying these rumors were offensive and playing off stereotypes of Appalachia. They said that people not from the area did not understand how impoverished some places could be, and that some people do live off the land more. But that doesn't make them savages. They stressed that people down there might not have the luxuries of people in more populated areas, but they weren't inbreeding or eating children. John Gullion, a local journalist to the area, wrote an extensive piece for the site thesmokies.com. He talked about the Dennis Martin case and the cannibalism rumors in great detail. He said that the supposed reasons why the locals kept quiet about the feral people was because the Smokies brought in too much revenue for Tennessee and North Carolina. He had some very choice words to say about this. If there were roving bands of feral cannibals kidnapping families, I can promise you this: my high school would not have had a football team. Every able-bodied boy and several of the girls would have been up in the mountains, heavily armed, and hunting wild people like deer. I'm not a hunting guy, but we'd have been up there spotlighting wild people like deer. We'd be capturing them and putting them in zoo cages to show the tourists. We'd have guys showing up to class with a wild man carcass in the bed of their pickup. In pre-World War I, a poor, mistreated circus elephant killed someone on a rampage in Irwin, and a mob of East Tennesseans demanded that the elephant be hung in the street to serve as a warning. I suppose to other marauding elephants. The people of East Tennessee are going to hang an elephant from a crane, but are going to keep bands of feral, cannibal humanoids quiet just to get a few more tourist dollars? No. One of the most interesting parts of Guillon's article was that he discussed a book written by Michael Bouchard, who interviewed Harold Key for a book he was writing. The book is called Forever Searching. Here's the account in full. Quote, Mr. Key reported before walking into the woods with his family, he observed an unoccupied white vehicle parked along the road in the Sea Branch area of the park near Rowan's Creek. Mr. Key said at first he did not pay any attention to the vehicle. Mr. Key said he walked about 300 to 500 yards into the woods and observed a middle-aged white male. Mr. Key said the man was by himself. The man walked quickly to the road and entered the white vehicle and drove off at a high rate of speed, throwing gravel in the air. The vehicle was heading in the direction of Cades Cove. Mr. Key later recalled that when the man saw him and his family, he began walking faster. Mr. Key said the man appeared to be perspiring heavily and was acting nervous. Mr. Key recalled, he said to his wife, "That man, he is thinking strange thoughts." The interview obviously had some inconsistencies, likely due to the fact that 50 years had passed. But it's another interview with Key, whose account was largely not investigated, so we wanted to include it. Though Key's story changed considerably, he did see someone lurking about in the woods that day, but he likely did not see an inbred horror movie cannibal or Bigfoot. Obviously, Bigfoot or semi-human cannibals seem a bit far-fetched. But to play devil's advocate, we would like to talk about the possibility of people living off the grid, or wandering the forest to do illegal activities. There are moonshiners and illegal marijuana plantations in the Smokies. The rangers openly talk about this. There could very well be dangerous people frequenting the woods. As far as an actual off-grid settlement, McCarter actually discussed this a bit in his book. McCarter's journal from June 21st reads as follows, quote, Rescue squads drive jeeps to Derrick Knob, and we also search a large section of Middle Prague at a place called New World. This area is at the Upper Thunderhead Prong and is the site of an old logging camp and railroad from the 1920s. There are pits, barrels, old foundations. It gets its name from a settlement dating back to the Civil War, when several families moved here to escape the war. They lived in peace through the conflict because they had erased any sign of their coming and never made contact with the outside world during the war. So there is precedent for an off-grid settlement, but that was during the Civil War. Obviously, it would be harder to do now, but there are disorganized groups that live in the woods. Homeless people do occasionally set up in the woods, and it can sometimes be a problem. Inexperienced people have caused forest fires before. Groups of homeless people will sometimes leave debris and trash deep in the woods. But they're not forming a secret culture of cannibalism and inbreeding. It's very possible that the wild men that McCarter referred to were actually real and just a few hermits he'd seen. It's absolutely possible for people to live in the woods off the grid. To bring up Poliitis again, in his latest documentary, Missing 411, The Hunted, he interviewed a group of men who'd set up a hunting camp on government-owned land. Granted, the main point of the segment was to play Bigfoot calls the men recorded, but it was interesting that they'd started their camp in the 50s, and the National Forest didn't find it until 2014. They went 60 years for staying there for weeks at a time in the summer, in large groups without getting caught. People build cabins off the grid. People decide to live in the woods. But they still go to the store when they need supplies. They still speak English. That being said, there are serial killers who target hikers. Ivan Milat in Australia being perhaps the most famous. But America has had its fair share as well. There are also pedophiles, and the theory that Dennis was abducted was never really taken seriously by the National Park or the FBI. They brushed off Williams' concerns that Harold Key could have actually been closer to Spence Field than he thought. Worst of all, they apparently didn't follow up on someone who'd claimed to have seen Dennis in a white car, just like the one Key spotted parked next to his. But it's been over 50 years. If he was kidnapped, then spotted on the street shortly after, the window of time to save him has long since closed. Whatever really happened to Dennis Martin will probably never be known by the general public. But undoubtedly, people will continue to speculate, making the story stranger and stranger as the years go by. It's very possible that Dennis was taken by a nightmarish threat lurking in the woods. He could have been grabbed by a serial killer or pedophile who happened to be camping nearby. Or perhaps he was killed by a moonshiner or someone working a drug operation in the woods. Maybe even he was eaten, but by a bear or a hog, not some horror movie inbred cannibal. There is no shortage of real monsters in the woods. But perhaps, to some people, an elaborate culture of cannibalistic hill people is less scary than the realities out there. That bears can and do snatch campers and eat them, or that someone on the trail with you might be prowling for victims. Or, the most simple explanation of all, that the woods are dangerous, and stepping just a few feet off the trail can get you lost enough that you will never be able to find your way out. Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include Reddit, the Knoxville News Sentinel, and the Tennessean. For a full list of sources, as well as links to our sponsors and contributors, please see our show notes. Please rate or review on your chosen app and follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.